Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome back for the second of Professor Wendy Brown's Tanner Lectures, Politics and Knowledge in Nihilistic Times, Thinking with Max Weber. We were treated yesterday to a fabulous beginning to this series of events. We'll reconvene tomorrow at 10:30 for its conclusion, a roundtable discussion with Professor Brown and Yale professors Katie Lofton and Paul North. Now, I am not so misguided as to attempt a summary of the nuanced and rich ruminations that Professor Brown led us through yesterday. Neither am I so presumptuous as to suggest what questions she will or should address this afternoon. So these brief, scattered remarks to introduce her today will serve, in effect, as tokens of my thanks to her for the thoughts she has set in motion and of my absolute conviction that she will do much more of the same today. The two talks from the end of Max Weber's career that Professor Brown has concerned herself with are usually translated under the titles Politics as a Vocation and Science as a Vocation. She has already signaled a first problem with these translations, the rendering of Wissenschaft as science instead of the broader knowledge. The German originals are Politik als Beruf and Wissenschaft als Beruf. Beruf, from rufen, to call. Vocation, from voco vocare, to call. Yet the word vocation in today's English has distanced itself from that vocalization, that calling from somewhere. Vocation has taken on pragmatic suggestions of employment, occupation, trade, craft, and so forth. To title Weber's talks Politics as a Calling and Knowledge as a Calling points us instead towards some of the issues and conundrums Professor Brown has already so productively raised. A calling would seem to be a trajectory utterly opposed to nihilism. A calling would seem to be allied with a seriousness of intent, a weightiness, a sobriety, which Professor Brown opposed yesterday to Nietzsche's gay science as a stance for countering nihilism. A calling would clearly, still today, direct us toward a religious experience of some kind, such as a vocation and calling both used to connote. And a calling, above all, would draw us toward that famous Weberian phenomenon of charisma, which he took over from writings of his time that associated it clearly with religious experience and with the mysterious power granted therein. A vocation does not quite have the power to rally itself toward these alliances the way a calling does. In having this effect, however, a calling accentuates the cross circuits and short circuits in our thought that Professor Brown has already begun to highlight. Charisma, after all, has been for most of us a suspect category, a lodging for nihilism, since long before the world according to Trump. Some of us look back guiltily at how the category itself seemed to us to have taken on a new, innocent, and happy life at the election of Barack Obama. And a calling brings to mind Althusser's interpellation, usually glossed as a hailing, by which ideological and repressive state apparatuses operate as modes of naturalized subject formation. These apparatuses are the ideological analog to the monopoly of the legitimate use of political force that served for Weber as his very definition of a state. At the same time, they set in motion the machinery of instrumental rationality against which he railed. The question of charisma as calling comes then to be entangled with false consciousness as hailing. Where are we to seek in this tangle legitimate modes of authority? What is their force? Or why have what we so often thought of as forms of authoritative knowledge ceased to have any appreciable force? Hard science itself, for example, having little or no influence over the neoliberal greed of fossil fuel industries, or all of us, the public, that burn their products. Professor Brown yesterday raised the Tolstoyan question, what then must we do? Perhaps in the end, I will be presumptuous, after all, and in petitioning her to raise one more word steeped in religious history and experience, what then, Professor Brown, must we students, intellectuals, and academics do when the ideological apparatuses have come to be directed by a profligacy of information in social media over which all controls as to truth content are strangled in the coils of technology, when we are faced with our excommunication from the society in which we work, launched into specializations that seem to widen this excommunicative gap, and all too liable to enact what you have called a knowing grimace, nihilism's signature. Please join me in welcoming to the podium Professor Wendy Brown.
Thank you. Not turned on. I have a little glaring. All right, there we are. Thank you. Going to put this away. These are the first things to go in our new ecological age. It's always nice to offer them. It's better to carry your own. Gary, thank you. The conversationalist in me is very tempted to toss this and simply respond. But that's not what I was paid for. So, tomorrow we'll do that. Yesterday, as Gary just said, we pondered Weber's efforts to counter nihilism at the site of politics, especially through political action animated by responsible, selfless pursuit of a collective cause. Today, I'm going to turn to Weber's efforts in science as a vocation to overcome nihilistic effects in knowledge and the academy, a project that for him depends on the severe depoliticization of both knowledge and the academy, and a project that I think ultimately fails in his own terms and fails us. Both the effort and the failure, however, are useful to our own thinking about responsible post-nihilist knowledge politics and post-nihilist world-making. So this afternoon, what I'm going to do is examine at some length first Weber's account of nihilism and knowledge before trying to think with and against that account for our own time. One prefatory note, one that Gary has partially taken care of, Wissenschaft, routinely translated as science, refers to all systematic academic study, not just the natural or the hard sciences. But there's more. At the core of the Humboldtian model of education that formed Weber and to which he was dedicated, in his time, the term Wissenschaft also carried implications of knowledge pursuit that was both unbiased and independent of influence, especially by church, state, and market. Knowledge that was therefore capable of arriving at truth. It's this complex meaning bundle that is at stake each time we hear science in Weber's lecture. Weber opens science as a vocation with a dark view of contemporary German academic life. There's its feudal organization, poor conditions for advancement, frequent failure to reward excellence. There are the confines of specialization, and what he underscores as the absolutely inevitable eclipse of every achievement by scientific progress. Above all, there is science's own disenchanting effect. With its promise that we can, in principle, understand everything, science, Weber insists, depletes whatever it touches of mystery and intrinsic value. It bleeds spirit with explanation. In its way, then, science, knowledge, Wissenschaft, is as violent as politics and as desacralizing as capitalism. In its way, it violates and desacralizes not peoples, nations, vocations, and relations, but meaning and value themselves. It topples faith and puts nothing in its place. It dispirits as it rationalizes whatever it touches. It divorces progress from the millenarian promise of improvement, emancipation, or happiness, and reduces it instead simply to accumulation of knowledge and technique. It leaves the world more suffused with power, but more empty of meaning than it finds it. Such is the deep nihilism that Weber believes we face consequent to the dethronement of religious authority and the mystery of nature with knowledge. As science topples religious and theological perspectives on origins, order, and meaning, it cannot replace what it has destroyed. The inclination to do so, more than merely misguided, is for Weber itself a dangerous nihilistic effect. The voids open in a radically desacralized world create a demand, he says, for prophets and demagogues everywhere. At the same time, performances in the realm of knowledge that properly belong in the church and public life are themselves part of nihilism's destructive force, in which, as Weber formulates it, quote, the ultimate and most sublime values have withdrawn from public life. From another angle, in Science as a Vocation and the Essays on Method from which Weber draws much of the argument, Weber is at war. He's at war with Marx and Nietzsche for the soul of the social sciences, contesting what he regards as the norm-laden faux science of Marx and the anti-science of Nietzsche. He's at war with academic colleagues who preach in the classroom, whether German nationalism, value positivism, or syndicalism. The nationalists make the university, quote, into a theological seminary, except that it lacks the latter's religious dignity. The positivists, he says, make a category error. They refuse the Kantian dictum to submit everything to critical scrutiny, eschewing the interpretive dimension of understanding action and values, and dangerously overesteem the coordinates and the norms of the present. The syndicalists both spurn objectivity and exploit the power of the podium, the academic podium, in what he insists is the inegalitarian setting of a classroom. Weber is also at war with those who believe that truth rests in balancing or achieving compromise between contesting worldviews. That, he says, is a technique of politics, not science, and it expresses nihilistic relativism and trivialization of facts and ultimate worldviews. He's at war with those who would submit diverse views to competition, a technique he calls a market one, not science, and expressing the invasion of the university by market values. He's at war with those who pretend, quote, the facts speak for themselves, when facts do not speak at all, when this likely means that both matters of interpretation and what he insists on calling inconvenient facts have been strategically ignored, moves that bring the rhetorical sleights of hand appropriate to parliamentary debate into the classroom. He's at war with those who believe they achieve neutrality by structuring their historical or sociological accounts with realpolitik, with Darwinian adaptation, or with meta-narratives of progress. Each is an ungrounded theological remainder. He's at war with economists who believe their science establishes the normative supremacy of capitalism when all it does is describe its mechanisms. He's at war with philosophers and social theorists who believe they can assess, let alone certify, the validity of norms, rather than merely analyze their predicates, logics, entailments, and implications. And he is at war with those who believe in transcendental reason, who acknowledge neither hermeneutics nor differing modes of rationality, within which there will always be irrationalities. Weber's at war, but his enemies are not timeless stalwarts. Rather, he takes much of what he is fighting to symptomatize the political, epistemological, and existential crises of his time. He understands his moral political age to be one simultaneously drained of value, proliferating value, and cheapening value. His age is one in which value judgments themselves are reduced to what he calls judgments of taste, one that fosters personality in place of integrity and honesty, one that fosters license within unprecedented orders of domination. It's an age he famously depicts in The Protestant Ethic and Spirit of Capitalism as featuring sensualists without heart, specialists without spirit, where neither feeling nor intellect are preserved from rationalization, a rationalization that simultaneously renders us cogs in economic machineries and superficial individualists. Truth has come apart from meaning and value. It resides only in facts, themselves infinite in number, a reality, he says, that is so hard to bear that it generates reaction in the form of polemics, positivism, and millenarianism. Progress no longer comprises growing happiness, peace, or truth. It's limited to advancements in knowledge, themselves paradoxical, as they provide the basis for growing organizational, technological, economic, and political powers that escape human control and become world-blistering forces of power without right. Boundary breakdown is also a key symptom of the age. Nothing stays in its place because, absent a moral lodestar, as well as traditional organizing principles, place itself loses its coordinates and its value. In the domain of knowledge, the ramifications of this exceed the problem of impurity or Baudelaireization. Rather, the incessant mixing of what Weber refers to repeatedly as, quote, absolutely heterogeneous practices, most notably the analysis of facts and value judgments about them. That mixing of those practices degrades both, thus intensifying cynicism and disregard for facts, truth, accountability, and values. In short, nihilism ramifies as it corrodes the boundaries between preaching and teaching, entertainment and information, culture and politics, as depth, sobriety, historical consciousness, and care for both the soul and the world give way to superficiality, excitability, gratification, presentism. Weber responds to this crisis and the spiraling miscegenation of elements it foments with his infamous stipulation of arch opposites and an epistemological and ontological hygiene aimed at isolating these opposites from each other. The familiar cases are politics versus knowledge, the classroom versus the public square, fact, value, empirical and theoretical claims, normative judgments, and the truth of empirical propositions. For Weber, though, not mere conceptual tidiness, but the world itself is at stake in drawing and enforcing these oppositions. If the relative organicism of earlier epochs has given way to fragmentation and specialization in the age of capitalism, bureaucracy, and secularism, this means order once maintained by hierarchy and authority has been replaced by what he terms the inanimate machineries, capitalism, bureaucracy, and so forth, that are also cleaved by the disorder of value concatenation, proliferation. With both organicism and authority thus receding, tightly enforced organization alone keeps things in place. And that is why, notwithstanding Weber's sensitivity to what he calls the chaos of infinitely differentiated and contradictory complexes of ideas and feelings in any epoch or ideational regime, and notwithstanding his admonition to scholars to avoid conflating concepts and typologies with reality, Weber's way through nihilism in the intellectual sphere depends upon epistemological, ontological distinctions that, more than descriptive, are sent into the field as police. But why formulate these absolutely heterogeneous spheres of endeavor and practice, knowledge, politics, facts, values, not simply as different, but as opposites that destroy each other if they touch or mix? Weber's adamancy on this front aims to quarantine nihilistic effects, ranging from the final destruction of truth. That destruction prevails everywhere for him except in empirical knowledge, to the final destruction of meaning, which prevails everywhere except in value, asserted values, the kind we talked about yesterday, to the final destruction of greatness, which prevails everywhere except beruf, calling, dedication to a cause larger than oneself for which one sacrifices the self. Thus, for example, for him, only by insulating the certainty of facticity from the absolute undecidability of values can the nihilistic condition that assaults and degrades both be repelled. Only by insulating knowledge from charisma can the classroom, as he puts it, unlock the world by means of intellect when students crave meaning in a world of moral chaos. And paradoxically, only by imposing unbridgeable moats between church, politics, and knowledge can the elements they once harbored together be secured in the wake of their fragmentation. Weber's protocols, then, do not simply shed the fetters of a less scientific era for the contemporary one. Rather, they address the world-destroying desublimations and boundary breakdowns of nihilism with a program of hygiene. They aim at challenging values warriors and politicians of every stripe who would bend facticity to their cause to the point of breaking it. They aim to challenge journalists and teachers who practice open partisanship via faux objectivity, selecting and arranging facts said to speak for themselves. They challenge the conceit that neutrality is obtained by balancing or synthesizing views, through competition among ideas, or through finding middle ground. They seek to preserve truth by confining it to facts, and to preserve value by confining it to politics, where its undecidability is on permanent display. Since Weber's more conventionally understood as simply codifying protocols of a value-neutral social science for a secular age, I want to pause a little bit over the specific crisis for knowledge that Weber's aiming to redress with his category purifications and separations. What's vanished in recent decades, he writes in a 1917 essay, The Meaning of Ethical Neutrality, is, and I'm quoting him, the widespread conviction among social science scholars that of the various possible points of view in the domain of practical political preferences, ultimately only one was the correct one, end quote. In its stead, he continues, quote, a patchwork of cultural values and personalities to advance those values have replaced the relatively impersonal because suprapersonal character of the old ethical imperative, end quote. In addition to value proliferation, truth's dethronement in morals and politics elevates the individual and personality as carriers of value. This, in turn, creates the demand for demagoguery in all spheres. However, the fusion of values with personality for him is especially troubling in the domain of knowledge and its transmission. As facticity wobbles along with ethical monoculture, the politico and the preacher invade the classroom dressed in professorial garb. Thus, the very historical conditions necessitating pristine scholarly integrity, respect for facts, consideration of values only as analytic objects, undermine it with the rise of personality. That cult of personality, Weber suggests, is everywhere. Students crave it, teachers rise to it and feed it. And today, of course, the ubiquitous culture of celebrity, combined with metrics for student evaluation of pedagogy, positively demands it. The classroom, Weber insists, is for training, not molding students. The distinction matters. It's for developing capacities, not shaping views. This means teaching the importance of what he calls inconvenient facts, distinguishing facts from evaluations and judgments, and disciplining students to, quote, repress the impulse to exhibit their own personal tastes or sentiments in their studies. They must be taught instead, he argues, that intellectual greatness rests in training, hard work, selfless devotion, and restraint, all the familiar Protestant virtues bundled into the scholarly vocation. These demands aim not merely to harness, but choke the will to power in intellectual life. Though, as Nietzsche and Freud understood, that life force would have to go somewhere, and we'll need to keep our eye on that as we go along tonight. Weber also knows that these demands aggrandize the ascetic forces, objectivism, neutrality, dispassion, denial of the very subject of knowing, that Nietzsche understood as turning us relentlessly against ourselves, our senses, bodies, historicity, faculties of interpretation, desires, and will to truth. This turning, Nietzsche insisted, would reach a crescendo in Western civilization, where we would come to will nothingness even as we broke into decadence, two manifest features of culture today. What is refusal to stem climate change and submit human governing to market forces other than the will to nothingness? And what is the festive spurning of facts and truth by power without right other than decadence? And yet, notwithstanding Nietzsche's insistence that science dwells exclusively in facts, his fiercest and finest moments in science as a vocation pertain to how scholars and teachers ought to deal with values. Why? Yesterday, I argued that Weber identifies values with politics, politics with partisanship, power, force, and at the extreme, violence. In fact, this chain of identifications is a shorthand for a historical process that Weber charts that has significant bearing on our problem. In one of his earlier methodological essays, Weber identifies values not with politics, but with culture. To be cultural creatures, he says, is to be, and I'm quoting him, endowed with the capacity and will to take a deliberate attitude toward the world and lend it significance. He adds that the very concept of culture is a value concept. Empirical reality becomes culture to us because and insofar as we relate it to value ideas, end quote. So how then does value shift from the cultural to the political plane in late modernity? Values become political in Weber's terms when they are deracinated, detached from a shared authoritative worldview, when they become matters of struggle undecidable except provisionally by rhetorical, legal, or physical force. As we saw yesterday, this is also when they become at risk for nihilistic hyper-politicization. Moreover, the politicization of culture, arising from value uprooted from foundations, detached from authority, is part of what makes liberalism crack. Multiculturalism in the broadest sense, not just our modern sense, only works when culture remains depoliticized. A depoliticization itself possible only so long as value is both anchored and common. Identity politics did not change all of that, but is rather an expression of its loss. The chain of distinctly contemporary identifications that Weber establishes between values, politics, partisanship, and force does three consequential things. First, it converts all values into practical positions available to beady-eyed analysis and situates their worldly enactment in a realm where the disjunction between motives and effects demands responsibility to this disjunction rather than to principles alone, what we talked about yesterday as the tragedy of action, the separation between principles and how they're enacted in a dynamic world. No religious or other moral garb can shield them from this. The second thing that chain of identifications between values, politics, partisanship, and force does is make the political domain a gladiatorial theater for contexts of value, or what Weber calls warring godheads. Third, it renders that theater a potential, though not inevitable, stage for a post-nihilist recuperation and pursuit of value in the context of historically specific forces, both raging and quiet, that are destructive of value. But this chain of identifications also has implications for scholarship, for curriculums, and pedagogy. It's this chain of identifications that animates Weber's argument that developing and disseminating teaching knowledge must not be infected or inflected with values. If values are political, because inherently contingent and partisan, then the slightest normative impulse is poison in scholarly waters. More than bias or interest, it brings undecidability, but also force and potentially charisma into a place that is wrecked by them. Again, these stern demands for objectivity in research and analysis, for value neutrality in the classroom, are themselves the result of Weber's post-foundational framing of values. No universal norms or transcendental moral commitments for him, no tests or tissues of justifications to establish validity. It's because they're ungrounded, cannot be secured by or as truth, because they're irreconcilable with each other, and because this is the nature of politics, that values at war with each other is the essence of the political realm. Far from lamenting or seeking to solve the consequent irrationality of the political domain, Weber dreams only of tethering it to responsibility, limiting its violence, and keeping it away from knowledge. Values are political, politics is a field of power and violence, knowledge materializes only where all of this, power, passion, partisanship, violence, are in abeyance. Weber identifies this opposition in language itself. He writes in a famous passage in Science as a Vocation, "In the political sphere, the words you use are not the tools of academic analysis, but a way of winning others over to your political point of view. They're not plowshares to loosen the solid soil of contemplative thought, but swords used against your opponents, weapons, in short. In a lecture room, it would be an outrage to make use of language in this way." End quote. Words of seduction versus words of analysis. Words as weapons versus words as plowshares. War and peace. The differences are polar, not matters of degree. Weber adds, whenever an academic introduces his own value judgment, a complete understanding of the facts comes to an end. Unquote. Impartiality, neutrality, adherence to facts and methods, all of this are absolute opposites to the investment, demeanor, and effect of the prophet and the demagogue. The first traffics in cool reason, the second in hot passion. The first seeks truth, the other power. One stirs curiosity and contemplation, the other attraction or repulsion. Weber's fierce insistence here is precisely that eruption of the will to power and knowledge that we knew was not completely containable. Yet Weber does not simply eject values from the objective knowledge field. This would leave their power intact. That power has to be devitalized to insulate knowledge from it completely. So, he shifts values from the subject to the analytic object of knowledge, transposing the register of values from the knower to the knowable, gives science dominion over them, and reveals their inner logics and external implications as it reveals their foundationlessness. The magical powers of values are neutralized, if not neutered, by analyzing them as norms with programmatic and policy entailments. Their meaning, he says, is reduced in the classroom to their relation to other values. As he puts it, the obligation of the scholar or teacher is to show you that, quote, if you choose this particular standpoint, you'll be serving this particular God and will give offense to every other God. This is how, he adds, we can compel a person, or at least help him, render an account of the ultimate meaning of his own actions, and if a teacher succeeds in this respect, I'd be tempted to say he's acting in the service of ethical forces, that is, the duty to foster clarity and a sense of responsibility, end quote. Now, if the idea of such value neutrality is widely challenged today, this is not what mainly interests us in Weber's wrestle to protect knowledge and value in a nihilistic age. Rather, what's striking is how values are transformed by casting them as normative positions with analyzable precepts and logical entailments, by bracketing what Weber knows well is their erotic, religious, and other non-rational dimensions, by lifting them from historical contexts that give them specific meaning. Weber is the master theorist of our attachment to values for all sorts of historical, visceral, experiential, ultimately ineffable reasons. He knows well that values themselves emanate from cultural and political traditions, of course, but also from desires, ambitions, hopes, delusions, resentments, rancor, revenge, everything Nietzsche depicted as, quote, erecting ideals on earth. Yet Weber's demand that the scholar, and especially the teacher, approach the study of value as purely contingent standpoints with inevitable entailments, oppositions, and exclusions, both distorts and devitalizes the practice that he identifies with our deepest humanity. It accelerates disenchantment as it converts not merely how things work, but worldviews themselves into dry logical norms, drained of their captivating and motivating forces, and their capacity to alter the very meaning of history and the present, hence their own meaning in practice. Weber insists that the academy be this drying shed and that the faculty be laborers within it. This is a more profound assault on values than even Nietzsche's demand for their revaluation. The latter leaves intact their seductive powers and weaponry. Weber's mandate aims at disarming them of both. And in direct contrast with Nietzsche's re-embedding of post-nihilist value in eros rather than analytic deduction or decision, Weber treats value at this point in the lecture as if it could be based on rational consideration of its abstract entailments, even as he knows this is not how values work in the world. Thus do Weber's knowledge protocols simultaneously abet the emptying of the world of value and constrain the reach of human knowing. Treating values thus also requires Weber to refuse Nietzsche's insistence on the absurdity of accounts from nowhere, Nietzsche's eulogy for that dangerous old conceptual fiction of a pure, will-less, timeless, knowing subject with its eye turned in no particular direction, its attempt at expunging the active and interpreting forces. More than merely rejecting Nietzsche's radical interpretivism, his expose of the will to power at work in all-knowing, Weber demands the asceticism that Nietzsche diagnoses as the illness itself culminating in nihilism. Weber affirms what Nietzsche calls the castration of the intellect, the no to life, and also the protective instinct of a degenerating life that Nietzsche identifies with the ascetic ideal. Its program of starving the body and the desires as the will to power turns against the life instincts themselves in thinkers. An ascetic life is a self-contradiction, Nietzsche writes. Here rules a ressentiment without equal, that of an insatiable power will that wants to become master not over something in life, but over life itself, over its most profound, powerful, and basic conditions. Weber knowingly insists on this masochistic diversion of the will to power and salts the wound by underscoring the fleeting quality of scientific achievement. The scholar he represents is a spiritless vessel of a meaningless cause, requiring self-negation and draining meaning from the world one analyzes. This is the ascetic practice Nietzsche predicted would culminate in willed nothingness. It gets worse. More than merely prescribing a regime of spiritual intellectual starvation, Weber builds something of a torture chamber for the man with the vocation for science. He is condemned to the frenzied accumulation of facts, combined with the destruction of value, that's at the heart of Weber's own diagnosis of modernity's slide into darkness. Sheldon Wolin writes, like the Calvinist of the Protestant ethic, Weber's scientific man accumulates, even as what he amasses has no more lasting value than other things of the world. Thus does Weber repeat in a scholarly register both the morphology of capitalism once its spirit settles into what he calls mechanical foundations, and the morphology of depression that nihilism induces. Driven but aimless, agitated, obsessive but without purpose, desire raging but choked, repose unavailable. With eyes wide open about the modern machineries killing human freedom, value, and satisfaction, Weber builds his cage of knowledge and scholarship from their blueprint. Means separated from ends, the scientist reduced to a means, the ends receding altogether, a wheel whose turns we never get off. In contrast to his crafting of Beruf for politics, Weber makes the true scholar immanent to and replicative of these forces, embodying the frenzied accumulation and overtaking of ends with means to become a slayer of value and complicit with modern apparatuses of domination. Affirming knowledge as contributing to such power while denying completely its enlightenment link to human emancipation, Weber would have been unsurprised, I think, by an information age producing unrivaled capacities for surveillance and manipulation of human subjects, an epoch of capital subjecting everything and everyone to the vicissitudes of finance, and academic knowledge so compartmentalized, so subspecialized, that most disciplines were useless in anticipating or apprehending the mounting crises of ecology, humanity, and democracy now upon us. Weber saw the dark ahead, but his path to containing nihilistic destructions of knowledge and truth drove straight into it. Against conventional readings of Weber's lecture on science as affirming scientific protocols for their own sake, I've been emphasizing his nearly hyperbolic efforts to protect knowledge against its own late modern effects. I've also been suggesting that his approach to nihilism's boundary breakdowns, its trivialization of fact and value, its evisceration of depth and integrity, its dethronement of truth, that Weber's response to this was a kind of pharmacon in both senses of the word, a scapegoating to produce order and a cure drawn from the poison. His performative counter to nihilism's ablative force was to stipulate, separate, narrow, and quarantine. Knowledge gets rationality and secularism. Politics gets charisma and its religious spirit. Knowledge gets mind. Politics gets body and soul. Knowledge is drained of passion, judgment, or ardor for a different world. Politics runs on their fuel. Knowledge pursues truth. Politics traffics in power. Knowledge is specialized and removed from the world. Politics deals with the whole and the visceral. Intended to restore order and place when nihilistic decadence was destroying both, these divisions, I've been arguing, let the beast in by another door. As Weber submitted what remained of value to the grinding gears of disenchantment in the knowledge realm, he surrendered its prospects for renewal to the magical force of charismatic domination, leadership, in the political one. He affirmed empirical study of the past and present while rejecting knowledge as critique or utopia. Indeed, knowledge as he conceived it was pinned to the powers of the present. Only charisma in the political realm could break open the new and the different. To the extent that neo-Weberianism has shaped the modus operandi of social science in the last century, I'm suggesting that it choked and scolded scholarly endeavor that would challenge and replace the trajectories that have brought us here. Instead, disruptions have been left largely to the acquisitive drives of markets and technology, and to leaders and movements too often devoid of the characteristics Weber assigned to the charismatic genre: restraint, selflessness, responsibility, a public vision. These divisions also deprived social science of intellectual mediums through which to fathom modern political subjects constituted by complex desires, frustrations, wounds, reactions, fears, anxieties. Indeed, subjects animated often by abjection, rejection, subjection, and resentment as much or more than by reflections on norms or interest. At the same time, these divides abandon an informed, active democracy as either an academic mission or an agent of political change. Instead, they leave that citizenry to its cultural psychic stew of susceptibility and exploitability. In this, too, Weber limits the relevance of academic endeavor to post-nihilist world-making, to reinfusing the struggle over values with ardor harnessed by knowledge or accountability. Instead, his protocols for knowledge meant that the academy would perversely withdraw from the world at the moment that it was released from the church. Opposing fact and value as Weber does also ignores how values acquire meanings and valences through the historically specific rationalities that administer them, specific discourses they intersect, purposes and projects that transform them as they are actualized. Far from self-governing, the meaning of values in politics is always modified by such encounters. And that's why, of course, genealogies matter. It's why norms in the political sphere do not operate as logical premises and entailments as they do in philosophy. It's why normative political theory of the analytic variety is in this way oxymoronic. It's why originalism on both the right and the left is always only another political tactic. It's why complaining about the co-optation of one's principles always misses the point. Consider, conceptually, liberalism promises to protect human dignity and political equality. In fact, it sacrifices these as it intersects with powers of class, racial, and gender superordination, and is more recently transmogrified by the governing form of rationality we call neoliberalism. Liberalism has no pure operation outside the philosopher's study any more than socialism does. Thus, its porous account of liberty has not merely been cynically weaponized by the right to wave free speech banners over Klan rallies, or by corporations to dominate electoral democracy with their economic might, or by organized evangelicals to erode sexual and gender equality. Yes, these are calculated, strategic moves, but they're not outside liberalism's bounds. Rather, they nest comfortably within and draw succor from liberalism's neoliberal transmogrification, which supplants democratic legislation with traditional morality and markets to order social life. Just as we cannot think well about free speech today in abstraction from powers of contemporary social media or mobilized social hatred, we will not think well about liberalism in abstraction from its plutocratic, neoliberal, authoritarian, and other anti-democratic formations. Now, this example reminds us that a post-nihilist approach to values, in both knowledge and politics, requires more than reckoning with their lack of foundations or the disconnect between their aims and effects, and more even than their affective charge. Rather, a post-nihilist approach to values requires grasping always their embeddedness in specific forms of governing reason and their deployment through particular technologies and interpretations. It requires addressing their actualization by and amidst meanings and powers not part of their own vocabulary or aim. If this was an element of what Weber sought to capture with his ethic of responsibility in political life, we would do well to incorporate it in political and social theory as well. But no baby out with the bathwater. Weber is surely right that we must teach students about facts and facticity, even as this means teaching them as well about the constitution and interpretation of facts, their inescapable historical, material, discursive, and hermeneutic dimensions. He's right to insist that we're bound to explain why no value system is ever true with a capital T, but that far from bringing analysis and judgment to an end, that very condition is what heightens the importance of analysis and judgment. He's right to insist on self-consciousness and restraint in proffering our own political views, even if this can't be fulfilled in the way he demanded, because from the study of Kant to evolution to climate change to the Constitution, there are only ever interpretations, renderings through specific languages of disclosure and judgment. Moreover, however vital it is to open out the silos and methodological lockdowns of the current organizations, protocols, and especially specializations of knowledge, it's equally vital to articulate and protect the interval between politics and the academy. Discovery, critique, and reflection are fundamentally different from political action, legislation, and dicta. They beckon different subjects and subjectivities, draw on different languages, temporalities, aims, and ethoi. Thus, the demand that a curriculum comport with any political program must always be countered with an account of how they destroy each other when conflated. In addition to keeping political agendas at a distance, scholarship today, of course, needs protection from being bought or invested in by the powerful, valued only for its commercial applications or job training, and from destruction by those with anti-democratic ambitions to keep the masses stupid and manipulable. Even with the world in an emergency state, then, where every scholarly hand is needed on deck, we need a version of the moat between knowledge and politics that Weber sought to establish. That moat is vital to protecting reflection, imagination, and accountability in knowledge production and dissemination. It distinguishes the place where values are struggled for and where they're probed and queried, Or as Stuart Hall shaded the matter, it distinguishes the theoretical domain, where we deconstruct meaning, make meaning slide, from the political domain, where we seek to arrest that slide in order to make our meaning hegemonic. Healthcare is a human right. Trees have standing. No person is illegal. Restore the rule of law. Science is real. Black Lives Matter. Such claims cannot be taken apart in the midst of political battle, but must be opened and queried in the classroom. Critiques of racial and gender essentialism, consent, autonomy, choice, human rights, examinations of the slippery semiotics of corporations and personhood, or the problematic elements of contemporary quests for sovereignty and statehood, the failures and aporias of constitutional democracy, all these may inform political projects, but they can't be taken on board in the midst of an immediate political fight. Nothing is more corrosive to thinking and knowledge than domination by a political program. And nothing is more impotent in politics than the unending reflexivity, critique, and self-correction required for serious intellectual inquiry. Yet the relations are as important as the corridors of separation, especially for democratic life, which cannot survive an uneducated public in contemporary times. Put the other way around, neither political life nor education can be democratized alone, and anti-democratic forces shaping both are mutually reinforcing as well, forming today a downward spiral. Indeed, erosion of access and erosion of quality in public higher education and denigration of the value of higher education apart from job training are among the most underappreciated strategies of the combined neoliberal and right-wing assault on democracy in the past 4 decades. At the same time, the combination of academic specialization and professionalization, the steady replacement of public with private research support, and neoliberal pressures for economic deliverables from research and teaching, together these have diverted a great deal of university research and teaching from public worldly purposes, exactly when we need the opposite turn. In this regard, it seems to me we have lately been too much absorbed by issues of academic freedom and too little by matters of academic responsibility. The former is not trivial, but it's the latter that holds our collective future. In the context of the multiple perils I sketched at the beginning of yesterday's lecture, it seems to me the most urgent question for scholars today is not what have I the right to say or do inside or outside the classroom, but rather what curriculums, strategies, and classroom conversations might contribute to holding back the dark and limning new possibilities, what research agendas that might not yield the same degree of recognition or the same degree of status as those in the mainstream might make that contribution as well. How do we interrupt the reactive personal politics in which students have been steeped to incite deliberation about values embedded in and potentially altering large-scale economic, political, and ecological trajectories? How do we break the siloization and professionalization of knowledge, turning us away from the world? And how do students, faculty, and administration alike shed absorption with enhancing personal and institutional capital that prevents that break? Essential to this work, I think, is turning hard toward rather than away from values in the classroom. And by this, I don't mean promulgating values. Rather, as Weber suggested, classrooms are where values may be studied as more than opinions, ideologies, family party, or religious loyalties, but also as more than distractions from the empirical, technical, instrumental, or practical. It's where they can be deepened as worldviews and considered in the context of the specific powers that mobilize and transmogrify them. It's where they can be examined genealogically, culturally, economically, and psychically, that is, as complex reaction formations, not only analytically or through the prism of morality and religion. It's where values can be discovered in powers that disavow or consecrate them through feigned neutrality or technocracy. And above all, it's where they can be framed as at once undecidable yet decisive in responding to the multiple crises of our time. This would constitute a vital counter to a nihilistic age in which values are trivial and instrumentalized, a political age in which they're widely perceived as monopolized by religionists on the right and by identity and moral dicta on the left, a counter to an era of consumer capitalism in which they're reduced to branding, celebrity, and market share, a counter to a technocratic era in which they're buried in platforms and apps or consigned to ethics consultants, and a counter to a secular age in which they are presumed to be private or personal. Recentering the study of values in higher education would also counter the steady pressure on universities, especially public ones, to elevate vocational training and STEM fields above all else. Again, that push, which threatens to contract, if not eliminate, the most important remaining venue for deep study and informed reflection on the world and one's place in it, could not come at a worse time in history. If Weber worried about classroom polemics destroying conditions for objective learning, it seems to me that is hardly the most serious threat to classroom integrity today. Nor, despite the hay made of it by the right and the media, is concern with triggering that widespread or important, especially outside the tiny universe of elite schools. Rather, it seems to me, the quotidian depressant of intellectual seriousness among students today is anxiety about individual futures, manifest as preoccupation with grading rubrics and techniques for meeting requirements with minimal investment. And then there are the crushing effects of the unprecedentedly schismatic consciousness borne by sentient young people today. On the one hand, they've internalized the mandate to precisely calculate and titrate their every educational, social, civic, and personal self-investment, relentlessly tending their human capital value to build their future individual prospects. On the other hand, they're alert to the looming global, ecological, political, and economic catastrophes that make the world in which they're tending this value quite likely to crash out of the universe. No generation has ever stared so directly into its own lack of collective future while managing such intense, complex requirements for building its personal one. More than cruel optimism, this predicament is simply too much for most young spirits, leading them either to drop out and join Extinction Rebellion or to put one entrepreneurial foot in front of the other as if they were not walking through and toward catastrophe. If they dwell mostly in one side of this impossible split, the other part periodically shrieks through, and a great deal of medication may be required to manage the suppression. They are in a mode of pre-apocalyptic survivalism, as we all are in some ways. Our task is to address this condition, not by telling students what to think, but by acknowledging this predicament and breaking it open with deliberately post-nihilist questions. What are you living for? What world do you want to live in? How should or could humans order our common arrangements and our relationship with the non-human world at this juncture in world history? Again, empirical analysis, how things work, and material analyses, what historical forces brought us to this past, what powers organize it in the present, all of these are critical in framing and answering such questions. Literary, theoretical, philosophical, artistic, and other modes of depicting and interpreting the world are indispensable as well. All are part of educating for democracy and addressing a post-nihilist development of values. To be clear, this is not an argument to place the question, what is to be done, at the heart of the college curriculum, nor is it an argument for tolerating all viewpoints in the classroom, a liberal shibboleth that diminishes rather than builds the stature of values. Weber would have us replace that tolerance with fearless scrutiny and hence depersonalization of values. Today, this would include, among other things, showing students why relentlessly personalized justice claims, I'm offended, wounded, excluded, and values imagined as very nearly written on the body themselves mark a nihilistic loss of world. This loss and its expression require our thoughtful, even compassionate exposure in order to move students toward curiosity about and reinvestment in larger order trajectories of power and values. Yet study, scrutiny, and deepening of value concerns is not how undergraduate curriculums are designed today. Apart from pressure from every quarter to turn all but elite colleges in vocational directions, putatively norm-free methods in mainstream social science, where values remain unwelcome and illegal aliens, actively discourage scholarly discussion of exactly this kind in most social science classes. This is compounded in the study of social and political behavior and certain kinds of philosophy by the reduction of values to norms, norms to opinions, and opinions to personal beliefs or attitudes. For Weber, values simultaneously bear our individual human depth and are at the heart of collective self-making. They are, for him, uniquely threatened by the forces of modernity, diminishing our capacity and our belief in our capacity to craft our lives and the conditions of our lives. This, for him, is the essence of nihilism. Culturing value and placing struggle over it at the heart of renewing democracy is all that carries the alternative to rule by unchosen forms of rationality and apparatuses of domination, by pure power mongers, or by technocrats. Indeed, Weber's insistence on warring godheads as the essence of political life is itself an anti-nihilist counter to Schmitt's infamous identification of that struggle with the friend-enemy distinction, to Lenin's reduction of politics to whom, who will dominate or overtake whom, or to the classic realist position that politics is governed by objective laws with their roots in human nature. It was Weber's appreciation of the inherently political and creative nature of value, and politics as the platform for struggling over value, that led him to reject the neo-Kantian effort to ground values in moral universals, the neo-Marxist effort to embed values in materialism and teleology, the neo-Nietzschean effort to invest culture or great individuals with the redemption of values, and what would become the neoliberal surrender of values to markets and moral traditionalism. Yet even as he rejected rationalist, naturalist, theological, or other millenarian foundations, Weber sought to make values accountable to thought and tether their enactment to responsibility. We've spent these evenings with Weber because, for all of his evident limitations in limning the kinds of social and political theory that we might need to apprehend our current conjuncture or renew possibility within it, Weber did understand that rekindling the value of value amidst its nihilistic diminution or destruction entails recommitting to our humanness in a double sense. Values carry our distinctive political capacity to craft the world according to chosen purposes, when that capacity seems nearly extinguished by the forces now governing and imperiling our lives and future. This recommitment also entails embrace of the purely human construction of values and of our complexly human thinking, feeling, psychic, cultural, and historical attachment to them. Far from nihilism, as some have suggested, this embrace bears the promise of nihilism's overcoming. Only by affirming that we invent the values by which we live, and that our yearnings and fears, attachments and revulsions, and not only our traditions and intellects are all at play in this invention, have we a chance at becoming responsible for the enormous powers that our species alone is capable of unleashing, including on ourselves. Thank you. I think we get to talk this time, right?
We have time for some questions, and you need to come up to one of the microphones. It's either to me or Lyle.
We talked briefly last night, and I told her I was very nervous to talk to her, but now I feel like...
Now you're doing it in public.
Thank you. Weirdly, I'm weird one-on-one, but in public, I'm totally fine. Yesterday, I think more than today, you talked about how we need to hold ourselves accountable as a society and teach ourselves to desire a society in which we are fair and we see our lifestyle as sustainable and holding ourselves accountable and each other accountable. And it sounds like that would make everyone so self-conscious and anxious that we wouldn't be able to have meaningful interactions with people and take risks. And that sounds like even more audience-oriented subjectivity than Habermas talked about in his time. It seems like it's very justified, which you talked about. We are young people, like I just graduated from college, I'm terrified. How do you think that, you talked about on a curriculum level how professors should teach us to temper our anxiety and over responsibility and being really anxious about worrying about offending other people. How do you think that an individual in our inner voice could temper anxiety over responsibility and deliberation? Or do you think that at this point anxiety is inevitable in trying to be intellectually sound? Like, what's something that a 24-year-old like myself could tell myself every day to evade anxiety over, am I going to say the wrong thing to the wrong person today? I feel like everything is being recorded. Everybody has a camera on their phone. It's very audience-oriented subjectivity constantly.
So, to the question of whether anxiety is inevitable today, I think the simple answer is yes, for lots and lots of reasons. But the particular kind of anxiety that I think you're describing was not one I was addressing, but it is an important kind. Mm-hmm. And I think that what you're describing is anxiety about articulating views, positions, desires, wishes, hopes, preferences in a world in which you have become inordinately self-conscious about A, a non-shared worldview, and B, your own historicity and cultural place vis-a-vis others with different histories, different cultural places. It's unfortunate that that has become our preoccupation, because I think it's actually quite damaging to the possibility of not just being able to be at home in your thinking and so forth, but damaging to the possibility of being able to think together about what's really imperiling us in this world. So when I said briefly that I think the preoccupation with one's own personal political positioning, whether it's about being offended or potentially offending others, is itself a bit of a nihilistic expression. Here's what I meant. That I think it's a symptom of a certain withdrawal from world, abandonment of world, and what I referred to yesterday as that crisis of desire or collapse of desire for world and for making a world. It's a defensive, crouching posture, or it's a reactive, vengeful posture. But it has, it's actually choked in its powers and choked in its sense that there's the possibility of building a world with one another. So I don't have an immediate therapeutic solution for you and your anxiety, other than to try to create conditions, whether in classrooms or in public spaces or in political work, in which that is not our main preoccupation, and in which instead we try to ask ourselves the question again and again, what kind of world do we want to live in? What kind of world are we trying to build? What are the powers that currently imperil that possibility? And what are the possibilities of contesting those powers with alternatives? And those questions attempt to leap over or diminish the power of that anxious preoccupation with self, what I called yesterday the reduction to a world of one and a world of now, that is itself part of the nihilistic predicament. On the other hand, I think there's other kinds of anxiety that are absolutely inevitable and ubiquitous today that simply have to do with existential disaster. But also neoliberalism breeds a very particular kind of anxiety. That tending of human capital that I talked about is a 24/7 project, and it's one that only those who sleep will lose. And I'm not suggesting that therefore you don't sleep. I'm suggesting that you think about whether tending your human capital is really what you want to do in this world and how you want to make a difference in this world. Not everyone can opt out of it at every moment. An Uber driver can't be snarly and continue to drive. That capital has to be tended. I don't tell my graduate students to just say what they think at every moment. On the other hand, I do think considering what you really want to work on, what you really want to do, and what kind of world you want to bring into being is all that's left. Because otherwise we will die clutching our human capital. And there's better things to clutch when you die.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Wendy,
Morris.
thanks so much. Two quick questions, one for Weber and one for you.
Oh, good.
For Weber, on knowledge, with all of the distinctions that you enumerated and that are familiar to many of us, most of us probably, what happens to hermeneutics? What happens to the need for interpretation? It seems to me that that's kind of built into Wissenschaft, but violates all the binaries that he sets up.
Yes.
That's for Weber.
Yes.
For you, will you please say more about democracy?
Oh, okay. I was trying to get away from myself in these talks. Morris, of course, you're right. Any Weber, student of Weber knows that he often gets misrepresented as a positivist. He was anything but. He believed deeply in hermeneutics. He fought for hermeneutics against the positivists in his time, and thought that what you had to do in order to interpret facts did not change the fact of their being facts. And what you do is not bring values to facts, but you bring the problem of interpreting them to facts. So it's a kind of hermeneutics that we have made messes of over the 20th century, Pache, Gadamer, and many others, but his understanding of the hermeneutic project was about the interpretation of facts and the interpretation of values, but wasn't one that challenged the facticity of the object. There's more to say on that, but I'll leave it alone. What did you want me to, what aspect of democracy did you want me to talk about?
You said many things that I think help us think about education and culture within democracy. But I kind of, if you'd say a little more about where we go sort of after
Yeah.
neoliberalism.
Okay.
Could I
So, sorry.
Might I add, because my question
Yes,
really
please.
will say something.
Great,
to
great.
that.
Hi.
A wonderful pair of talks, leaving
Thank you.
us bereft and beroofed. I guess my question would be, at the end, you had a negative attitude toward vocational education, which seems strange given that both of Weber's essays were about vocations. And so my question on the democracy is, it seems as if you sent me back to read those essays, that the education of politics for a vocation and of knowledge for a vocation was not imagined as education for all democratic citizens.
That's right.
But actually for people who were going to be either scholars or
That's right.
politicians.
That's right.
And that's where the question of what a democratic education
Correct.
would follow that would be different from either Weber's vocational education
Yes.
or the education that you spoke to. Whether, just to think of two of his contemporaries, either Dewey's senses of a democratic education or Gramsci's sense that everyone is a legislator, everyone is an intellectual.
Great. So, trying to think about where to go with this. One of the reasons that I find Weber's essays so provocative and love to teach them is precisely that he speaks to a a contemporary set of problems and a contemporary set of forces, our contemporary forces and problems, from what seems like a deeply conservative and even anti-democratic direction. You're absolutely right that his understanding of what scholarship is for is not for an educated democracy, and teaching is not even to educate students, although there are those gestures, educate democratic citizens. There are those gestures when he says, clarifying values, clarifying the meaning of your values, and there he's really scolding the Bolsheviks and the socialists in his classrooms. Understanding what you really stand for and what the implications are of what you really stand for and the violence of what you may stand for is part of what we do as responsible educators. So there are those gestural moments that go toward being a thinking citizen, but for the most part, that accumulative dimension of knowledge is for scholars themselves or for science itself, and potentially for the development of technique in the world, but it's not actually about educating the masses. And that's why I said he leaves us to our cultural psychic stew that he knows nihilism has produced, and therefore joins in those who would go for a plebiscitary democracy or fairly contained, stripped-down democracy. One of the reasons that he's so interesting to me is that he's the precursor to the neoliberal anti-democratic force that the ordo liberals, Hayek, and others will develop. The suspicion that democracy, if it ever was useful for anything, is over in the age of mass enfranchisement. So then the question is, what do we do with him there? Why did I make that move against vocational training or converting universities into vocational training and make the argument for what we classically call liberal arts education? It's probably not so common in the experience at Yale and its associates as it is in the public universities, this enormous press to make students job ready the moment that they graduate. And by job ready, really what's meant is their readiness to enter not simply the higher professions, but jobs in which they have technical skills so that they don't have to go to coding school after they have their BA, so that they don't have to add to their education, but can go right into mid-level professional jobs. And what, of course, is being pressed out there is the idea of educating democratic citizens. And I've written a lot about this, and so have a lot of other people, but obviously that couldn't come at a worse time in history. The need for not just literacy vis-a-vis media and being able to separate fact from garbage on the internet, but the importance of actually being deeply educated in a range of fields has probably never been more important if we're going to have a democracy. It's the time in history when it is no longer possible to imagine democracy working if citizens themselves don't have basic understandings about, or basic literacies in economics, politics, history, and social life. And I don't mean sophisticated versions of that. I mean just knowing how to think about what they're hearing and encountering in the world and having some sense of where we are in time and space in the early part of this century. And I think, therefore, that the press for vocational training in its opposite meaning, not the meaning that Weber meant, I didn't spend time on this in this essay, I've written about it elsewhere, but the idea of the calling, the being drawn to something, but also being in service to a particular activity or project or purpose in the world, that Weber secularizes from its divine form, is absolutely the opposite to that job readiness, that availability to and readiness for training. So I have been arguing for years that nothing is more important to renewing democracy than educating for democracy, and nothing has been more powerful in destroying democracy than diseducating, than wiping out not just the meaning of the value of higher education, but also in trying to alter what it would be for. I will also add that I don't think we, on the left, have helped that situation. I think we have tried to argue for the importance of the humanities or the importance of our various kinds of obscure practices and research as if that's at the heart of educating for democracy. And I personally actually believe that whatever we are called to research is one thing. What we need to be doing in educating for democracy is another. I have never completely bought the line that the scholar-teacher is a unified subject. And I'm at odds with most of my colleagues in that respect. I think we really need to think hard about what kinds of curriculums, what kinds of courses, what kinds of books, what kinds of texts, and what kinds of conversations democratic citizens need to have today. And they will not be just, left or right or anything else. It's more about, what do they need to be steeped in? And that's really different than what I love thinking about in my study. And I am perfectly happy to live with that split. I don't know that all of my colleagues are.
Thank you. I wanted to hear you say it again.
Okay.
There is another event coming in this auditorium. I've promised them we will be out by 6:30. Please join us at 10:30 tomorrow morning. And join
Great.
me now in thanking Wendy.
Thank you for your questions.